And if you were, put your shoes in a journalist, outside of the information that you were hearing, but with your kind of background of like looking at these type of patterns, what would you have done just with the declassified information that was out there?
It's a hard question. The pressure on American journalists from their media corporations and from their bosses who didn't want to lose access was a lot. So there were journalists, American journalists, who did try to publish stuff, and I think you've talked to some of them, Jonathan Landay and Warren Strobel at the Philadelphia Inquirer, Knight Ritter. Yeah, Knight Ritter. These guys...
just start that segment again.
Okay. Oh, there were some examples of American reporters who, within the constraints of their employment, were able and did ask many of these hard questions and expose some of this stuff. And two examples of them are the Knight Ritter reporters, Jonathan Landay and Warren Strobel, who I know Warren personally. But, and there's others there at Knight Ritter as well who worked closely. Some of them had some good contacts down at Central Command. And so they understood not just what was the unclassified information, but also with good reporting, actually talking to people in the Pentagon about specific things. They did that, and they reported on it. And if you go back and look at the body of work that the Knight Ritter organization produced, you will see that if only that had been on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post, things would have been different. But those things were not on the front page. Knight Ritter's reporting, in fact, I believe they've won an award for the level of war reporting that they did. Very good stuff. American-produced stuff. We didn't have to rely on overseas media. But it was not on the front page of the mainstream papers, and it was not being echoed by television news at all. Not by any of the main ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, certainly not Fox, but even the other media outlets were not pushing this line. So for some reason, and this I don't know because I'm not a media person, but for some reason, reporting the truth on the Bush-Cheney administration in 2002 was not popular amongst the people that make the decisions as to what we will report. And I don't know exactly why. It's funny, I remember during the Clinton administration, there was a huge amount of talk, and I guess you still hear it, about the American media being liberal, being left liberal, democratic in orientation as opposed to Republican. You hear these things, and yet Bush and Cheney were Republicans, had a very narrow mandate, if any mandate. I mean, there was some concerns in the 2000 elections, and you would think that the so-called liberal American media would have picked up on things that Knight Ritter was doing and said, "Oh yeah, this is true. Here's a fact. Here's evidence. Here's what we know," and yet they didn't do that. So I think there's another question we have to ask ourselves: what does it mean? Is the American media liberal? First off, and second off, does it matter if they're all registered, or 90% of them are registered Democrats, and yet they really do whatever administration wants them to do in order not to jeopardize their contacts, not to jeopardize their ability to reach audiences, then it really doesn't matter what their politics are, because effectively they will serve as mouthpieces of the current, whatever the administration is. And certainly we've seen that now. But it's not just the media. Congress had access to far more information, not all congressmen, but many of the committees had access to far more information about what was going on. Certainly they could call in, and did call in, people like Paul Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld, and ask them hard questions. They had far more information than even the media did, and did a far worse job in trying to sort it out and to play their role as representatives of the people. And the Congress represents the people who are the parents and the siblings and the family members of soldiers that we sent to Iraq, and almost 900 of them came back in boxes. So far, they continue to die. And so I think they did a really criminally poor job in representing the people and the interest of the people. So I don't know, it's an awful thing.
And when you look at the I think you mentioned these talking points that you're receiving in the Office of Special Plans.
Oh, yeah.
And then when it was on the front page of the New
Sure.
York Times, it was deleted. So can you...
Yeah. Well, in the fall of 2002, the Office of Special Plans was formally split off from where I worked in Near East South Asia to be its own entity. It was still under the same boss, Bill Ludi. But one of the services that they would provide to us, the sister organization, and other staff officers throughout policy, was a set of classified talking points that we would include. We were directed to include these talking points in all of the papers that we would prepare for internal use up the chain to brief various people. So, for example, if my civilian boss had a meeting with the Moroccan ambassador to chat about what's going on in the world or the region, I would include those talking points from OSP in their entirety. We were directed to use them exactly as they were, completely, don't edit anything, and if you had something that came up 2 weeks later, don't go use the old ones, call them and get a new set. So I actually received not just a set of OSP talking points, but multiple sets as they evolved over time. And I actually looked at them and read them, which was my mistake really, because as I saw what they were saying, they were written in a way that made them sound very believable, but the things that they were saying were not substantiated by intelligence in all cases. An example of this is one of our talking points from OSP would say Saddam Hussein actively seeks uranium in Africa. Well, the intelligence on that said that Saddam Hussein in the late 80s, during the Iran-Iraq War, actively sought uranium and other nuclear-type support materials in Africa, but he hadn't done it during the 90s. He hadn't done anything like that since then. But that's not what the talking point would say. The talking point would gloss over the fact that things have changed and simply indicate that this was an active, ongoing type program. The talking points would emphasize that Saddam Hussein gassed the Kurds. Of course, this is something we talked about. I mean, the media had this frequently. He gasses his own people. And of course, the whole story of the gassing of the Kurds he did use some gas. We actually sold him the materials because at the time we were supplying Iraq in their war against Iran, and Iran also was gassing Kurdish villages on the border country there. So it wasn't as if the context of that gassing, there's no justification for that, but the context of it in the talking point would be not only did he do it unprovoked and under no other contextual reasons, but that he was ready to continue to do that. And again, that's false too, because we knew when he had last used his gas against his own citizens or the Kurds and during the Iran-Iraq War, and it was back in the late 80s, not any time sooner than that. So that was another example. They had one of the talking points that ran for a long period of time up through November, and then it was suddenly eliminated, was the Mohammed Atta meeting in Prague. The meeting that Mohammed Atta allegedly had in Prague with a member of the Saddam Hussein's intelligence organization. This was reported as if it was a fact, when in fact it was never a confirmed fact. It was a single point of report, denied by the Czechs, denied eventually on the front page of the New York Times by the FBI, who said, well, it didn't happen because we were watching Mohammed Atta and he was here in the States during that same time frame. Therefore, we know that meeting didn't happen because we had eyes on this guy prior to 9/11. Of course, that's embarrassing for the FBI as well to know that they were watching Mohammed Atta, but beside the point, once the New York Times came out with that statement by the FBI and by the American intelligence communities that basically said the Mohammed Atta meeting in Prague did not happen, then it was eliminated from our talking points. Now, the interesting thing is Dick Cheney continues to insist that that meeting happened, which just tells you how behind the power curve Dick Cheney is when it comes to the truth. But the OSP talking points did eliminate. They did respond to the news media to eliminate a very stupid talking point. But there were other stupid talking points that were not exposed by the New York Times, that were not corrected in the public mainstream, should never have been written in our talking points, because certainly the intelligence never backed these things up anyway. But we were still propagandizing our own people through these talking points. This is what you want to say to all of your guests and visitors so that they'll understand why it is so imperative that we do go into Iraq. So I saw these things. And the use of internal talking points to help and guide people is very common in the Pentagon. You know, if you need a legal opinion, you go to the lawyers and you get the legal opinion. But these talking points were largely, I would say, 60% invalid, in the sense that what they indicated was not what was substantiated by the intelligence. They were being, and the other weird thing is we were told to not draw from them, but to use them in their entirety, because it was clearly a method of kind of ensuring that the propaganda storyline through our outlets in the Pentagon continued to be supported. Of course, it was very surprising to me shortly after seeing the first set of talking points when I saw the same things being said by the President, Vice President in speeches, and read those same stories in the front page of the New York Times and Washington Post. It seemed to me very clear that this set of talking points was not just for us inside the Pentagon, but also being used as part of the public campaign to generate support. And again, that's white propaganda. That's propaganda from the government to the people to convince them of something, and that's not something that is normal, and it's not something that is accepted, and it's certainly not something the Pentagon is supposed to be involved in doing.
So can you describe the difference between propaganda and education?
Well, education, I think it's pretty clear what education would be. If I was going to educate you, or let's say your child, let's say I was a teacher, and I was going to educate your child that 2 + 2 is 4, except sometimes when it's 5. And your son or daughter came home and said, I'm learning a lot in school, 2 + 2 is 4, but then sometimes it can be 5. Now, you would respond to that and you would say, well, actually, son, no. 2 + 2 is 4, and it's always 4, and it's never 5. Your teacher isn't educating you. Your teacher is not. Education is based on fact, okay? It's based on truthful understanding of the reality that we see. And certainly different people have different perceptions, but education is to give you the grounding so that you can articulate various things, you can understand different perceptions, and you can analyze, and you can think. That's what education does. American people were never being educated by George Bush and Dick Cheney, or by Paul Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld, or any of these folks that were advocating this war. What they were being done, not education, they were being propagandized. They were being told, here is something awful that you need to be afraid of. I don't want you to think about it or ask any questions. Trust us to solve this problem for you. That's what it is, and that has nothing to do with education. That is, well, propaganda. It has a purpose, and the purpose is to change someone's mind about something. You can propagandize with the truth, obviously, and all good propaganda has elements of truth in it. Is Saddam Hussein a bad guy? Yes, Saddam Hussein is a bad, awful guy. It does not follow from that we would need to do all those things that we did. We don't need to invade his country. We don't need to run his country. We don't need to hand select his follow-up government. We don't need to do these things because he's a bad guy. In fact, it's very illogical that you would do that, because there's about 50 guys as bad or worse than Saddam Hussein around the globe. And we certainly don't have the resources to go solve their problem. That's assuming you could even do it through force, which we're seeing in Iraq that you cannot do it through force. We've actually made things far worse for most Iraqis than it was under Hussein's regime, which is an awful thing to think of, to think that we've actually made it worse for these poor people than they had it under Saddam Hussein, but we have. That's the end result. But you know, propaganda is trying to change your opinion about something. Education is simply to help you think about something. Here are some facts, and here are some strategies on how to deal with these facts, and here are some rules, and you put this all together, and you can come up with solutions. And so there's no difference. I mean, there's a huge difference between education and propaganda. Had Americans been educated about the truth about Iraq or the truth about the Middle East, what would happen, the situation we would have today is very different than what we have now. First off, I think Americans would be paying far more attention than they do to how the Israel-Palestine question is perceived throughout the Middle East. That's number one. Number two, I think Americans would be looking at the various governments in the Middle East, including those that we have allied ourselves with. We tend to ally ourselves with monarchies and dictators, which certainly Iraq was a dictator that we had allied ourselves with up until 1991, actually, when we invaded him. Pakistan, the Musharraf in Pakistan is another example of the kind of guy. You know, Musharraf in Pakistan conducted a military coup over the elected democratic leader of that country. And we not only failed to strongly condemn that, we immediately stepped up aid to Musharraf after he had done this. And so I think if Americans were educated on our Middle East policy, they would not see the need necessarily to go into any of these countries militarily, but they may well see the need to adjust some of our foreign policies that we've had for a long period of time, which don't promote our interests. I mean, if you're the country that's seen as backing up corrupt dictatorships and despots and old-fashioned monarchies that don't have any kind of popularity in their own country, if you're seen as the country that makes this possible, certainly the country that backs up Israel, Israel is perceived by many in the Middle East as being very heavy-handed, being very careless about the humanity and values of the Palestinian people and other Arabs. So this is what education would do. Education would allow eventually allow our foreign policy to be much more rational. But obviously we didn't want education. What we wanted was propaganda. And propaganda is beating the war drums, which they did very, very effectively. And they're still trying to do that, but Americans have been educated against the will of the administration, but because of the way the Iraq thing has turned out, very ugly, very interminable, very awful. Some of the stories about Abu Ghraib and other examples of where we're not behaving ourselves in the American standard, or what we like to think of as the American standard. This has caused education to happen, and that's why Bush is in trouble, of course, this time around with the upcoming election. Because Americans have been educated, but they have not been educated because Bush, Cheney, or the administration wanted them to be. They wanted them to be propagandized, and that's what they spent all their time doing in 2002.
And can you speak, from your libertarian perspective, your conservative perspective, how you and other conservatives view the UN, but then at the same time how Bush is using these resolutions, saying we got to enforce international law.
Oh my goodness, it's
while
crazy.
At the same time violating international law.
Yeah, it's true. Well, certainly, national sovereignty is a concern. People want their country to be able to make decisions for its country. And there is a fear and a concern amongst many conservatives, probably a lot of liberals, and certainly libertarians, that we wouldn't want to see an international rule maker impose rules on this country. I can't speak for some conservatives, because there are a number of conservatives that are very protectionist oriented and they're not really pro-free trade. But a libertarian is very pro-free commerce, sort of like the Adam Smith kind of thing. We would trade with everyone and be an enemy to no one, that kind of thing. And if you want to have international trade that's free and fair and open, you will pay attention to the interests and needs and desires of all kinds of foreign countries. So it's not that there's a contempt for foreign countries at all. And if foreign countries organize and have a body like the United Nations is easy to criticize because it's, tends to be a little, it has problems. It has things, it has some corruption. It has waste of money. It has, in some places they've done well, but in other places they've done very poorly. Their track record is not strong. So it's easy to criticize the United Nations, but for libertarians, it's like not an issue. I don't think that they're concerned that the United Nations is in any way going to try to affect a country's sovereignty. Now, the conservatives take a harder look at that. They are concerned that the United Nations, things like the International Criminal Court, will come in and impact a country's decisions and sovereignty. And when George Bush speaks and Cheney speak kind of denigratingly of the UN, contemptuously of the UN, that's the audience that in part they're appealing to. The folks that think that the UN is awful and it's just sitting there ready to put its, have its clutches on our Constitution and tear our Constitution up and tell us what to do. But the driving force behind the Bush administration, and I would say any administration, probably Clinton was the same way, is self-interest. And it is in Bush's self-interest to do a number of things that seem very inconsistent and hypocritical. He says after the fact that we needed to do something about Saddam Hussein in order to restore the honor of the United Nations, because the United Nations had become ineffectual. That's not necessarily true, but that's one storyline. At the very same time, we have just cut off aid, military assistance and other kinds of aid to all kinds of countries who refuse to give us an Article 98 exception to the International Criminal Court. And an Article 98 exception means that if George Bush or Henry Kissinger, he's a great example to use because he's on the wanted list, I guess, of some of these countries. If Henry Kissinger travels to a country and he is then arrested by a citizen's arrest by some other nationality and turned into the International Criminal Court for some case, an Article 98 exception means that that country will not extradite an American citizen to the court or to a third country where the court might be conducting its work. So we ask for all these things. We don't want international law. Certainly the invasion of Iraq was never justified in any interpretation of international law. It just doesn't make any sense. It's inconsistent with that. So it's really just a matter of self-interest. Bush uses the UN when it looks like it's something that can justify a sovereign decision or a unilateral decision that he has made. And when it serves his purpose, then he also rejects the UN. I think it's really funny. Bobby Fischer, the Bobby Fischer story. Have you followed that at all? Well, Bobby Fischer played chess in Yugoslavia when Yugoslavia was under UN sanctions. And the United States said, we don't like that. We want to uphold the honor of the UN. This is back in 92, 93. So put out a warrant for Bobby Fischer's arrest for violating sanctions with Yugoslavia because he went and played chess there. And he recently was picked up in Japan. I guess he'd been living in Japan, and he was at the airport. Japanese picked him up, and they're going to extradite him to the United States to face trial. So we're going to try Bobby Fischer because he violated UN sanctions back in 92. At the same time, George Bush is not, he's punishing and threatening, or the administration is, all kinds of countries who will agree to extradite American citizens who might come under international criminal court proceedings. So it's very much a game of what works for me, and that's all I can say. I think truly George Bush, he has contempt, like many people in America do, for the United Nations. But the real thing with George Bush is he has contempt for anyone, including American citizens, who have something different to say, who disagree with him. And I think that's very clear with these so-called free speech zones that have been set up. I think it's very interesting. We've gone in this country, how many years? 226 years, at least over 200 years, and we never had a need for a free speech zone. I think most people thought that the whole country was a free speech zone. And now we have free speech zones. If the president goes to a city, if you have a T-shirt that says something, maybe a pro-Kerry, I don't know, something that doesn't please George Bush, they'll relegate you to a free speech zone, which is very strange, very, very strange thing. So I think Bush has contempt really for anyone who disagrees with him, and that would include the UN, unless it serves his purpose to use them, which he clearly has done.
And when you look at the beginning of March 2nd, and then March 9th, the London Observer had reported that Frank Cause of the National Security Agency had actually ordered the United Kingdom to continue, to kick up their, surveillance on the UN. Can you speak to?
Oh, I know nothing from a first-hand basis of that at all. But yeah, I think one way that we look at the UN is as an adversary, kind of as an entity. Instead of an organization, we actually see it as one more entity, a force to be reckoned with. And, would we spy on them? Yeah, of course we would, and I'm sure we're not the only ones. But, yeah, I think it just speaks to the adversarial relationship that George Bush has really with almost everyone. And that includes Americans. That includes, it's funny, to this day, George Bush has yet to attend, or Dick Cheney, a funeral, as far as I know. Not a single funeral from soldiers. Bush has visited soldiers in the hospital. He's done that. But he hasn't attended any funerals. It's a huge amount of contempt for the average American, for this country who has gone ahead, based on the lies that George Bush and Dick Cheney promulgated, have gone ahead and said, well, you've told us this, we believe you. Now we've discovered these things are lies, and yet we still don't see any sense that Bush and Cheney owe anything back to the American people. They don't. It's not like they were owed any sense of more truth. We're not owed a policy change. Certainly, we're not seeing any changes in the policy. In fact, I think the latest thing from Bush is that we got the wrong country. We should have gone into Iran. So, I mean, there's really no sense that Bush and Cheney are responsive to the, to the reality around them, American people or the international community. They're just not responsive to either one of those two sets.
Okay. When you look at where we're at now, and where we want to be with the whole world peace, and from a libertarian perspective, can you work with other people towards world peace, or how do we go from where we're at now to a place where we're all living in peace?
Well, you kind of touched on it with your question about education and propaganda. I think if Americans and politicians in Washington as a group become more educated on the facts about where conflict comes from, particularly anti-American conflict. Obviously, we're not as concerned with conflict between two third parties that don't affect us. But when it comes to how the world views America, it would be very good for Americans and Congress to recognize where that comes from. And this is not to say that we are self-flagellating Americans. Oh, we're so bad, our policies are so bad, and that's why everybody hates us. Or we're so wealthy, or we use so much gasoline that this is why we're hated. That's not true at all. We're a wonderful country, and the whole world knows it. In fact, we have our doors are being knocked down continually for decades and decades and decades, for hundreds of years. Folks coming to this country because they want to be Americans. They want to live in America. So we have a huge strength in what's good about America, but we don't have a good understanding of how, not just how we are perceived overseas, but most Americans have no idea what we're doing overseas. Now, libertarians would tell you, most of the things we're doing overseas, we don't need to be doing. We should stop doing those things. Libertarians will tell you, and some conservatives will tell you, that we don't need 100 or 150 bases around the globe. They'll tell you we don't need that. Libertarians may say, do we really need 13 carrier battle groups? I don't know, but they would ask that question. Most Americans have no idea the presence, the military forward presence that we have around the globe. It's just invisible to them. They don't think, so when they see people from foreign countries or the Middle East that complain, if they see attacks like 9/11, and we said that was Al-Qaeda, bin Laden was behind that, they think that there's no reason for that. Why would we be a target? Why would the Twin Towers and the Pentagon be a target? Now, the rest of the world sees it, and they see a target like the Pentagon, and they see that as a very symbolic target against this huge military empire that we currently have. Not that we're growing. We certainly are growing it with these new bases in Iraq and new bases in Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, where we are increasing our global military empire. But most Americans don't even have a clue that we have a global military empire. It's just not something that's we talk about or think about. And that's the kind of education that needs to happen. We Americans pay a lot of money for their government. From a libertarian's perspective, we pay way too much for far too little. So we would say less government in general. But certainly the average American who's not a libertarian ought to have a real good understanding of the kind of money we spend on the military and what we're actually getting for that. One of the things we're finding out with the 9/11 Commission, and certainly even before the commission has come out with their report, people knew this. How come four commercial airplanes could be hijacked in a period of 90-something minutes and nothing happened? And there was no significant domestic response to that. And one of the reports that I read had to do with the number of resources, airplanes, fighter airplanes, that could have gone up to intercept or eyeball the situation. We only had like 13 in the whole country. We're a very large country with a lot of border, and we only had 13 aircraft that were done. So where is the military defense budget being spent? Well, it's being spent projecting outwards. That's not defense, that's offense. We call it the Department of Defense, and everyone thinks that they're defending America. But quite frankly, that's not what they're doing with all those billions of dollars. They're not defending America. We are positioned for a forward battle, a Cold War battle, which has certainly been over with for 15 years. And we have never really downscaled our military and shifted into a true defensive military. We don't have one. I think what's teaching, we talk about education, what's educating Americans that this is true is this huge, radical, unprecedented call-up that George Bush has done of reservists and guardsmen who are considered truly defensive in nature. And yet he's deployed more of those folks to Iraq than anywhere before. And most of the guys over in Iraq understand they're not defending America. They may be doing many different things, but they understand they're not defending America. Of course, we all know that now. Saddam Hussein was no threat to America, so there was no reason to go over there. But even the folks that are there now, they might be helping Iraqis, they might be shooting Iraqis, but they're not defending America. So I think one of the good things that would help to have peace in the world, particularly in America, since that's one we control. We are Americans. We ought to be able to do our part. Part of our part is to truly maintain, and that may mean downsize, but truly maintain a defensive force, not an offensive force. Quite frankly, right now, we don't have anything that can defend this country. We have an offensive military. It can go and do damage to other countries.